The marble walls of Nero's palace shimmered beneath torchlight, glowing like the skin of a god consumed by madness. The emperor stood before his trembling court, draped in crimson silk, eyes glittering with the fever of divine obsession. The air was heavy with incense, wine, and fear, the scent of a civilization devouring itself from within. At the center of the chamber knelt a beautiful boy. Sporus, whose fate would soon become legend, whispered in disgust. The musicians stopped playing as Nero raised his hand, commanding silence like a priest before a sacrificial altar. The courtiers watched, petrified, their breath shallow, knowing that even horror must be applauded in the emperor's presence. Nero's voice broke the silence, calm and terrible, declaring that love must prove itself through blood and transformation. He spoke not as a man but as a god rewriting nature, demanding creation through destruction. Then, with a smile that chilled even his guards, he ordered the physicians to begin the unthinkable act. Sporus cried out once, a sound drowned beneath the laughter of those who dared not weep. The blade met flesh, and the room filled with a silence more violent than any scream. Some said Nero watched with fascination, whispering that his beloved was being reborn in beauty beyond mortal form. The court's eyes burned with tears they could not shed, trapped between pity and survival. When it was done, Nero draped Sporus in gold and silk, naming him his empress before the horrified elite. The ceremony ended not in applause, but in stunned silence, as Rome itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the empire burned with lust and decay, reflecting the soul of its ruler, a poet of cruelty. Nero's Rome was a world of contradictions, divine art beside torture, faith beside madness, beauty beside rot. He saw himself as both artist and god, moulding flesh and fate like clay in his divine theatre. Sporus was no lover now, but a living symbol of absolute control, carved into obedience. What Rome witnessed that night was not love, but the coronation of insanity dressed in imperial majesty. To understand that horror, we must descend deeper into Nero's world, where passion became power, and power devoured humanity. In ancient Rome, power was not merely held by the sword, but through the body, the bed, and the gaze. Desire itself was political currency, a weapon sharper than steel, able to enslave through pleasure instead of pain. Nero understood this truth better than any emperor before him, and it became the theatre of his cruelty. To dominate another's body was to possess their soul, and to display that domination was to rule all of Rome. In Nero's palace, love was not tenderness but conquest, an experiment in how far divinity could stretch human flesh. He surrounded himself with singers, dancers, slaves, and nobles who existed only to mirror his desires back to him. Every kiss, every glance, every act of passion became a ritual of submission, choreographed for the emperor's pleasure. Even the senators, proud men of lineage and war, bowed to the erotic spectacle of their ruler's command. Nero's feasts were orgies of obedience, where wine flowed like blood and shame was the only forbidden fruit. He turned intimacy into theatre, using humiliation as proof of loyalty and pleasure as the price of survival. In this world, to refuse the emperor's affection was to reject the gods themselves, a slow, suicidal rebellion. He did not seek companionship but transformation, to mold his partners into living reflections of his mythic self. When his beloved Poppaea died, Nero's grief mutated into obsession, a hunger to resurrect her beauty through another body. Sporus became the vessel of that delusion, chosen for resemblance and doomed by it to mutilation and worship. The emperor's passion twisted into ritual, to make his lover female, to craft a goddess from flesh defied by nature. In Nero's mind, this was not cruelty, but devotion elevated to divine art, sculpting perfection through pain. Sporus's castration was a coronation, a grotesque attempt to make love eternal by destroying its humanity. The emperor believed control over another's identity proved his own immortality, a victory over life and death itself. His court learned that to survive, they must praise what they feared and celebrate what disgusted them. They called his madness genius, his cruelty art, and his tyranny divine performance. Each whisper of dissent vanished into the marble halls. Buried beneath layers of music, gold, and terror, Sporus was renamed, redressed, and remade, paraded beside Nero as his empress before gods and senators alike. Rome gasped, but none dared laugh, for laughter had become a crime punishable by disappearance. Even in public games, Nero's desires leaked into spectacle. Men dressed as brides, women as warriors, all roles reversed. He sought to dissolve all boundaries, gender, morality, humanity, until only his will remained absolute. Power, in Nero's Rome, was the right to define reality and to make others applaud its perversion. In every sigh of submission, in every forced smile, the emperor heard proof that he ruled both flesh and fate. Thus, the empire's glory became an orgy of obedience, gilded, brutal, and utterly enslaved to one man's desire. When the boy's wounds healed, Nero announced to Rome that the gods had blessed him with a new empress. He commanded a wedding, not a secret rite in darkness, but a public spectacle beneath the open Roman sky. The Senate murmured in disbelief. The Praetorian Guard avoided eye contact, and the priests fumbled for words forbidden by law. Yet none dared oppose the emperor's will, for in Rome, obedience was survival and silence was virtue. The imperial courtyard glittered with gold, incense, and the tremor of restrained revulsion as Sporus entered, veiled in purple silk. Crowds gathered to witness what they could not comprehend, a marriage between a man and a mutilated reflection of his grief. Nero wore the robes of a groom, his expression one of divine triumph and manic tenderness. He took Sporus's hand, kissed him before the gods, and declared that Rome itself would celebrate their sacred union. Trumpets roared, poets recited verses, and the empire's most powerful men were forced to applaud the desecration of marriage. Sporus's eyes stayed lowered, his face pale, lips trembling as the emperor lifted his veil before the watching crowd. The audience gasped, some from horror, some from fascination, as Nero whispered to him, "Now Poppaea lives again." The boy was crowned Empress of Rome, seated beside Nero at the feasts where the nobility pretended to rejoice. Every banquet thereafter became theatre, with Sporus dressed in jewels and gold, carried through the palace like a divine idol. Nero's affection was suffocating, his lover chain-wrapped in silk, and his touch both tender and cruel. At night, he called him my wife, and by day forced his generals to bow before the emperor's bride. Even the statues of Rome began to change. Goddesses carved with the face of Sporus, temples renamed for his glory. But behind the illusion of divine romance lay a kingdom of dread and whispers. Senators spoke in coded phrases, poets wrote allegories about madness, and slaves vanished for careless laughter. The empire had become a stage play directed by a man losing his mind, applauded by those who feared him most. In secret, Sporus wept, caught between being worshipped and erased, existing only as the shadow of a dead woman. The castration had not only taken his body, but consumed his identity, leaving a living statue molded by Nero's obsession. Rome's historians would later describe this marriage not as scandal, but as blasphemy, a wound upon the empire's soul. Even the gods, they said, turned their faces away from the city that applauded its own humiliation. Yet Nero's delusion deepened, for he believed he had defied nature, created beauty beyond mortal limits, and conquered the boundaries of love. His court celebrated, his slaves obeyed, and his madness grew in proportion to the silence that surrounded him. Thus began the final descent, when the emperor of the world no longer sought conquest, but worship from his own reflection. Rome had always thrived on gossip, but under Nero, whispers became weapons sharper than any Roman dagger. Behind the marble columns of the Senate, men spoke of the emperor's madness in voices barely louder than breath. No law in Rome forbade ridicule, yet mocking Nero's marriage to Sporus was treated as treason against divinity itself. Those who laughed vanished into the night, their estates seized, their families erased from public memory. The emperor's obsession had turned his palace into a labyrinth of spies, lovers and traitors pretending to adore him. Sporus was kept close, always guarded, his beauty paraded before ambassadors as proof of Nero's divine creativity. Foreign envoys returned home, whispering that Rome's god-emperor had married his eunuch and demanded the world call it holy behind closed doors. Nero used intimacy as interrogation, seducing, testing, and destroying those whose loyalty wavered. Senators who resisted his will found themselves stripped of rank, wealth, and sometimes even their manhood. He believed that true loyalty could only be proven through humiliation, that fear ensured devotion longer than love. Even his advisors began to compete for proximity, offering flattery in exchange for a seat at Nero's nightly feasts. Each banquet became a theatre of betrayal, where men drank wine laced with suspicion and laughed at their own deaths. Sporus sat beside him, adorned like a goddess, his silence mistaken for complicity, his beauty for contentment. In truth, he lived as a prisoner wrapped in perfume, a jewel that testified to the emperor's sickness. When rebellion brewed in distant provinces, Nero dismissed reports, more concerned with composing verses for his beloved's next public appearance. He declared that poetry and beauty were more eternal than politics, that art would outlive any revolt. The generals who dared question him were accused of blasphemy, of envying the emperor's divine marriage. His mother Agrippina had once ruled him through fear, but now her ghost was replaced by Sporus's living silence. Even his guards began to wonder whether they served an emperor or a god who had forgotten he was human. The city's moral decay seeped from the palace outward. Nobles mimicked Nero's indulgence. Mistresses and slaves traded for survival. Public games grew bloodier, theatres more obscene, as the empire mirrored the emperor's madness. To prove its loyalty, Sporus became the symbol of submission itself, a living reminder that beauty could be both worshipped and destroyed. When conspiracies rose within the Praetorian ranks, Nero's paranoia reached divine levels, punishing imagined betrayal with theatrical cruelty. He executed senators by forcing them to attend their own funerals, laughing as they bled in ceremonial robes. Each act of cruelty deepened his belief that only through terror could he preserve his empire and his divine love. By making Rome fear laughter, he had turned politics into performance, a world where applause replaced conscience. The empire, once proud of its discipline and law, now bowed before the delirium of one man's desires. In that gilded madness, every act of power was foreplay, and every act of love was domination disguised as worship. Rome's streets glimmered with excess, yet beneath the marble and gold lay a city quietly suffocating in moral decay. The common people watched their emperor's madness as entertainment, confusing cruelty for grandeur and indulgence for divine blessing. The amphitheatres filled with laughter when slaves were burned, yet fell silent when Nero sang of tragic love. Every act of his life became a public play, and the empire learned to live inside his performance. Merchants sold statues of Nero and Sporus together, calling them sacred lovers, blessed by Venus and Mars. Children whispered their names in games, imitating imperial ceremonies without understanding the horror behind them. Brothels and bathhouses echoed with stories of the emperor's perversions, half in mockery, half in trembling fascination. The Roman people, long desensitized by blood and spectacle, could no longer tell devotion from degradation. Women of the noble class began painting their faces like Sporus, seeking the beauty of imperial favor. Men wore perfumes once reserved for brides, mocking their emperor even as they mimicked him to survive. Gender itself began to blur in the empire's capital, not through freedom, but through imperial imitation. The line between art and obscenity vanished, replaced by a single rule: whatever Nero desired became divine. Temples once dedicated to Jupiter now hosted feasts for Dionysus, where wine and lust flowed without end. Poets who refused to praise the emperor's love were exiled, their verses erased from libraries by trembling scribes. Historians who dared to write the truth hid their scrolls, knowing honesty could end with a public throat-cutting. For the slaves and the poor, Nero's world offered no spectacle, only hunger, silence, and the constant scent of smoke. They watched from the shadows as their emperor built golden palaces while Rome's alleys rotted in filth. The city became a stage of contradictions: grandeur in the temples, disease in the streets, despair behind closed doors. Rumors spread that the gods had abandoned Rome, disgusted by the empire's lust for pleasure without virtue. Some turned to new cults promising purification. Others prayed to old gods who no longer listened. In the marketplaces, people sold figurines of Nero's likeness, not in worship, but in fear of being accused of mockery. Every gesture of loyalty had to be exaggerated, every smile rehearsed, every silence timed to avoid suspicion. Even laughter became dangerous, for one misplaced word could mean execution for treason of the tongue. The emperor's marriage to Sporus had infected the empire's soul, reshaping love, gender, and morality into grotesque reflection. In Rome's villas, aristocrats mimicked Nero's tastes to prove loyalty, staging private feasts of cruelty and spectacle. The empire's moral compass had been replaced by theatre masks, beautiful, polished, and utterly hollow. Underneath the gold and silk, Rome was crumbling, its spirit drained by indulgence disguised as enlightenment. The people had become spectators to their own decay, clapping for madness because silence meant death. Thus, the greatest civilization on earth began to rot from within. Poisoned by its emperor's love of performance, power, once absolute, began to tremble beneath Nero's feet like the cracking marble. Of his own palace, the empire he ruled through fear was beginning to whisper his downfall. In the shadows of forgotten streets, revolts erupted in distant provinces, the legions no longer cheering his name, but spitting it in secret. Even Rome's Senate, once obedient, began to question whether a god who bled was still divine. Nero ignored every warning, retreating deeper into fantasy, where applause drowned out prophecy and art replaced truth. He performed songs about eternal love while his empire starved, blind to the irony echoing in his verses. Sporus followed him through every performance, his face a mask of devotion concealing quiet despair. The boy who had once been a victim was now an unwilling witness to an empire's collapse. Whispers reached Nero that the generals in Gaul had declared him an enemy of Rome. In his madness, he blamed everyone but himself, the Senate, the gods, even Sporus, for bringing bad omens. He began accusing his servants of betrayal, executing them in grotesque plays where death was applauded as performance. Sporus begged him to flee, but Nero laughed, calling himself immortal and untouchable, destined for divine resurrection. The Praetorian Guard, once his loyal sword, began to disappear from his palace one by one. He would wander the corridors at night, singing to Sporus in a trembling voice, calling him by Poppeia's name. The boy endured, trapped in a nightmare of devotion, a living relic of the emperor's decaying soul. Outside, the city grew restless, the people mocking Nero's concerts while soldiers marched toward the capital. When the fires of revolt reached the gates of Rome, Nero finally felt fear for the first time. He demanded that Sporus accompany him, not as a lover, but as a witness to his last act. They fled the palace disguised in rags, the emperor of the world hiding like a thief from his own creation. In the ruins of a villa outside the city, Nero wept beside a dying fire, clutching Sporus's hand. "I am an artist," he whispered, "and Rome was my performance." But the performance had ended, and even the gods refused to give him an encore. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state, stripping the title of emperor from his trembling shadow. Sporus, exhausted and hollow, watched as Nero prepared his final act of control to end his life by choice. He tried to lift the dagger but could not, forcing his servant to guide it through his throat. The man who claimed divinity died gasping for air, pleading for applause that never came. Sporus stood over the body, neither crying nor rejoicing, only breathing the silence of liberation and horror. For a moment, Rome itself seemed to exhale, as if relieved that madness had finally taken its own life. But the damage was done. The empire's soul had already been reshaped by Nero's love of power and pain. Sporus was taken by the new rulers, paraded again as a curiosity, beauty once owned by a ghost. He had survived Nero, but not the world Nero created, one where shame and spectacle had become the same. After Nero's death, Rome did not cheer, it sighed. A wounded animal finally free of its master's hand. Yet freedom brought no purity, only the hollow echo of the sins it had learned to applaud. The empire had been reshaped by his madness, its people trained to mistake fear for loyalty and spectacle for truth. Even in death, Nero's shadow remained, an idea too intoxicating for Rome to bury completely. His statues were torn down, but secret paintings of his face survived in brothels, taverns, and private gardens. The plebeians whispered that he was not truly dead, that he would return from the east as a god reborn. 3 impostors would later claim his name, and each time, thousands followed, desperate for the return of their cursed emperor. Such was the power of performance. Even in disgrace, Nero's myth lived longer than his empire's conscience. The Senate tried to erase his memory, chiseling his name from monuments, yet history refused to forget, for what Rome had witnessed could not be undone. The theatre of cruelty had entered its bloodstream forever. The marriage to Sporus became legend, retold in hushed tones by philosophers and poets who sought meaning in madness. Some said it was divine punishment for Rome's arrogance. Others called it the final proof of power's corruption. And in the middle of this legacy stood Sporus, the silent survivor of a love that was never love at all. After Nero's fall, he was claimed by Otho, a rival who had once been close to the emperor. Otho took Sporus into his household, treating him as a relic of power, a souvenir of the fallen god. He dressed him again in royal silk, paraded him at feasts, and called him empress before the same trembling courtiers. It was not affection, but mockery, a cruel echo of Nero's theatre revived for political amusement. For Sporus, every gesture of kindness was a reminder of the blade, every smile a repetition of the wound. He existed not as a man, not as a woman, but as Rome's memory of its own perversion. In him, the empire saw both its glory and its guilt, the cost of worshipping beauty over humanity. When Otho died, Sporus passed into the hands of yet another ruler, Vitellius, who sought to humiliate him in public. Vitellius announced plans to reenact Nero's wedding, but this time, the ceremony would end with Sporus's ritual death. Rather than endure another performance, the boy who had once been crowned empress chose to end his life by suicide. His final act was silence, the only form of defiance left to a body that had been rewritten too many times. In that silence, the empire heard its reflection, a civilization capable of worshipping its destroyer while destroying its worshippers. Philosophers later wrote that Sporus represented Rome itself, beautiful, enslaved, and mutilated by its own desire for control. His tragedy outlived his name, becoming a moral parable hidden beneath centuries of dust and denial. The historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded his story not with sympathy, but with a strange fascination for Nero's insanity. To them, Nero's acts were not isolated. They were the logical consequence of unchecked power and divine delusion, and yet, they could not help but write with awe at the man who made horror look like art. Rome's future emperors learned from Nero, not morality, but caution, the art of disguising madness beneath ceremony. The spectacle remained, the cruelty endured, but it was now wrapped in discipline and law instead of music and silk. The Colosseum itself, built only a few decades later, was a monument to that lesson. Order applied to blood. Nero's reign had proven that the people would tolerate any cruelty if it came with entertainment. The emperors that followed, Domitian, Commodus, Elagabalus, all inherited fragments of Nero's disease, repeating it with their own flavor of spectacle. They understood the psychology he had perfected, that beauty and terror, when mixed, make obedience irresistible. Sporus's name faded from records, yet the archetype he represented endured. The powerless made divine to serve the powerful. In every empire that followed, his story repeated in new forms. Slaves adored, courtiers destroyed, bodies sacrificed for symbols. The tragedy of Nero and Sporus was not an exception, but a prophecy of how civilizations collapse under their own indulgence. It showed that once pleasure becomes a political instrument, morality becomes decoration, and truth becomes theatre. Roman writers began calling Nero the artist of ruin, for he had turned cruelty into performance and worship into spectacle. In the centuries that followed, Christian chroniclers used his image as the face of Antichrist, the man who replaced love with lust for power. They called him the beast, the blasphemer, the one who set Rome aflame both literally and spiritually. But they also recorded, perhaps unknowingly, the birth of a pattern that would haunt human history forever. From royal courts to modern stages, rulers would learn that adoration could be commanded through fear and fascination. Nero had written the script. The world merely kept performing it under new names and new crowns. The psychological impact of his reign rippled through art, politics and sexuality for centuries, blurring the line between beauty and cruelty. Even in later empires, the allure of power's intimacy, to dominate through love, remained irresistible. The Romans themselves became haunted by the paradox he embodied, that the pursuit of pleasure could become the purest form of punishment. Historians who tried to explain him found themselves lost between disgust and admiration, unable to separate the monster from the artist. And perhaps that was Nero's final victory. Immortality through infamy, achieved by turning horror into legend. Archaeologists centuries later would find fragments of statues of a veiled youth, believed to represent Sporus. His face, though eroded, still carried that same tragic serenity described by the chroniclers, beauty born from violence. Those broken statues spoke louder than any text, telling the story of the empire's most forbidden marriage. It was not marble that survived, but memory, the kind that infects generations with fascination and shame. Nero's Rome had taught the world that no civilization collapses overnight. It decays through applause, luxury, and silence. Its theatres and temples remained, but their gods had changed, replaced by emperors demanding love in exchange for fear. The same disease of spectacle, once born in Nero's court, would echo through medieval kings, inquisitors, and tyrants of every age. The names changed, the costumes evolved, but the performance remained eternal. The worship of power disguised as devotion. Through Sporus, humanity saw what happens when love is stripped of freedom and turned into ritual obedience. Through Nero, it saw the cost of believing that art can justify cruelty and power can sanctify sin. Their story endures because it exposes something eternal, the human hunger to be adored, even at the expense of others' pain. Nero died believing he had created beauty. Sporus died proving that beauty can be destroyed by love itself. And between their deaths lies the true legacy of Rome, not the empire of marble, but the empire of madness. History does not repeat itself in exact form, but it often rhymes with the madness of those who came before. What Nero began in marble halls, many would later recreate in palaces, cathedrals, and studios of glittering illusion. The instruments changed, not daggers and silk, but cameras, speeches, and curated worship from millions behind screens. The same hunger remains, the need to be seen, adored, and obeyed by those too afraid to turn away. Nero's world burned under the weight of his performance, and ours glows under the blue light of digital fire. Power still disguises itself as beauty, cruelty as creation, and manipulation as love dressed in devotion. The emperor's stage has expanded. Now it stretches across nations, timelines, and glowing pixels that crown modern gods. Like Rome, we build idols out of fascination, celebrating those who shock us into submission and call it art. Every time a crowd applauds cruelty, history echoes the laughter that once filled Nero's golden hall. Sporus lives on too, not in flesh, but in every soul that learns to smile under domination. He exists in those who become symbols for others' ambitions, praised for beauty, but stripped of freedom. The cycle of adoration and control never vanished. It simply learned to dress itself in new, acceptable forms. When Nero forced his court to watch his madness, we now watch ours willingly, streaming it, sharing it, glorifying it. Rome collapsed when spectacle replaced meaning, when performance mattered more than morality, and fame outshone wisdom. We are not so different, still chasing applause, still defining truth by what entertains, rather than what endures. The emperor who mutilated love now stands as a mirror for modern power. Seductive, theatrical, and empty, he taught the world that influence is most dangerous when it becomes art, because art justifies everything it touches. When cruelty becomes creative expression, even empathy begins to look unfashionable, and truth starts sounding like rebellion. That is the modern lesson of Nero and Sporus, not ancient scandal, but eternal human weakness. History hides their story, not because it is distant, but because it is too familiar to confront. Every empire that forgets humility eventually builds its own golden palace. Glittering on the outside, rotting within, Nero's Rome fell not from invasion, but from indulgence, a civilization that entertained itself to death. His obsession with control through beauty became the blueprint for countless rulers, artists, and influencers who followed. He proved that when admiration replaces accountability, corruption no longer looks like evil, it looks like genius. Sporus's tragedy reminds us what happens when human beings become metaphors instead of lives, symbols instead of souls. He was reshaped to fit another man's grief, turned into a monument of someone else's madness. His silence speaks louder than Nero's performances, the quiet cry of all who were loved only as illusions. In every age, there are Sporus figures, those consumed by systems that demand transformation for the sake of approval. Their suffering becomes aesthetic, their pain a narrative, their humanity erased in the name of someone's greatness. And yet, history gives us a choice that Nero never allowed his court, the choice to stop watching. The power of the spectacle dies when the audience refuses to cheer, when silence becomes moral rebellion. That is why this story still matters. Because every empire, every system, every culture faces the same temptation: to turn horror into art, submission into loyalty, and cruelty into beauty. The Romans did it under torches and marble. We do it through glass and light. But the core hunger, to control, to be adored, to feel immortal, remains unchanged through centuries. Nero's voice still echoes in modern palaces, in leaders who mistake admiration for love and obedience for truth. He was the first influencer king, the first artist emperor, the prototype of every celebrity who built empires on illusion. His madness was not only in his acts, but in how easily others accepted them to survive. That complicity is what keeps the disease alive, the quiet applause that makes tyranny eternal. For every Nero, there must be a court willing to kneel, to call cruelty divine and silence noble. And for every Sporus, there must be a world too fascinated to rescue, too entertained to care. This is the hidden legacy of their story, not just tragedy, but a warning carved in gold and blood. The warning that brilliance without empathy becomes destruction, and beauty without consent becomes horror. When power disguises itself as passion, it becomes the most seductive lie humanity ever tells itself. The Roman Empire fell, but the psychology of its ruler survived, whispering through centuries of politics and art. We see it in those who believe they can recreate perfection by remaking others in their image. We see it in nations that worship strongmen and destroy the weak to prove their purity. We see it in cultures that confuse fame with truth and pleasure with purpose. And like Rome, we call it progress, even as we applaud the fire consuming our own reflection. The legend of Nero and Sporus endures not because of its obscenity, but because it reveals what civilization hides. It shows that the boundary between divine love and desecration is thinner than we like to believe. In Nero's Golden Hall, surrounded by terrified courtiers, that boundary vanished, and the gods of Rome fell silent. In our world, the silence continues, not from fear of emperors, but from addiction to spectacle. The same silence that allowed a boy to be mutilated now allows truth to be forgotten. History is not distant. It is alive in the choices we make every day about what we celebrate. Each time cruelty becomes content, or suffering becomes entertainment, Nero's ghost applauds in the shadows. And Sporus weeps again, not as a victim, but as a reminder of what humanity trades for applause. So when we look back at ancient Rome, we are not gazing into the past, but into a mirror. The flames that once devoured Nero's city burn now in quieter forms: vanity, obsession, spectacle, and indifference. Empires no longer collapse from invasion, but from the exhaustion of pretending that decadence is destiny. The lesson of